Welcome to the third lesson in our chosen world religion, Buddhism. We pick up our story shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment. Now at first, the Buddha was reluctant to teach because what he had realized could not easily be communicated in words. The Buddha had discovered in enlightenment that it was only through discipline and clarity of the mind that delusions and ignorance would fall away, and that a person could experience what he called the greater reality, the truth about the nature of life. Anyone who was listening without that direct experience would be stuck in their own worldview or reality and would easily misunderstand everything that the Buddha had to say. There's an old Star Trek film from the 1980s called The Voyage Home, and it takes place not long after the character Spock, who's a Vulcan, has been brought back to life. His friend, Bones, a doctor on the Starship Enterprise, asks him what it was like, meaning what was it like to die? Now Spock, who was a typical Vulcan, tells the doctor that he can't possibly understand and he can't possibly have a conversation about it because the doctor has not experienced what he's experienced. Bones says, "You mean unless I die too that you can't tell me what it's like?" And this is a little like the feelings that the Buddha had immediately after his enlightenment. The experience and what he'd come to realize was so far removed from how everybody else thought that he couldn't imagine how such a thing could be shared with words. In the end, though, it was compassion that persuaded the Buddha to at least try. As you will have already read in the third installment of your notes, not long after his enlightenment, the Buddha went to a deer park in Isipatana, which is located in what's now known as the province of Uttar Pradesh in India. There, he came across the 5 companions who'd earlier abandoned him when he'd decided that asceticism wasn't the way. And these 5 became his first disciples. There, he preached his first sermon to them. Now, it's worth taking note of a couple of things here. Firstly, an understanding of when in our history these events were supposed to take place. The Buddha was born approximately 500 years before the birth of Jesus. Stories about his birth, his enlightenment, his teaching, all of that was mostly oral to begin with. And there were various versions making the rounds around villages and townships. These stories continued to change even after Jesus was born 500 years later in 1st century Palestine, which was a little more than 4,000 kilometers west of Deer Park, where this first sermon took place. After stories about Jesus' birth had reached India, many of the Jataka, and that's the word used for the birth stories of the Buddha, changed, as did other stories about Siddhartha. Some have suggested that even the idea of people who had once abandoned him becoming his disciples were also influenced by such stories about Jesus' birth. And that's not to mention all of the Hindu legends and stories that came before Prince Gautama was born. And all of that influence is important when we consider the value and the meaning of these stories. Now, eventually, as with many other traditions, the Buddha's words and deeds were written down. His sermon at Deer Park has been preserved as what's known as the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and its focus is on the 4 noble truths, which you've already studied a little bit in our second installment of notes. Sutta is the name given to a sermon, or a portion of a sermon by the Buddha. More than 10,000 suttas are collected in what's called the Sutta Pitaka, one of the most important collections of scripture in Theravada Buddhism. The word sutta literally means thread. Follow the thread, follow the Buddha's teaching. So, instead of teaching about his actual experience of enlightenment, the Buddha, much like a doctor, chose to prescribe a path of practice, which, like medicine, people could realize through that course of prescription or that course of teaching, could realize their own enlightenment for themselves. It would be like someone telling you how to get to heaven rather than describing what heaven was, so that you could see and experience it for yourself. However, heaven is probably a bad comparison to enlightenment or to nibbana or nirvana, since enlightenment or nirvana is not really a place, but a state of being. And you might have heard people say the Buddhist heaven is nirvana or nibbana. That's really not entirely accurate. More accurately, it's a state of not being, a state of not consciousness. But we'll discuss that more when we study the concept of nirvana, which is also known as nibbana. The Buddha devoted himself to teaching and attracted in the course of his teaching over many years hundreds of followers. Eventually, stories describe how he became reconciled even with his father, King Suddhodana. His wife, the devoted Yasodhara, whom he'd left to go and seek enlightenment, became a nun eventually and a disciple of the Buddha. And you might remember when he'd also abandoned his son Rahula, also became a novice monk at the age of 7 and spent the rest of his life with the father. So stories go. During this time, the Buddha travelled tirelessly through all areas of northern India and Nepal. He taught a diverse group of followers, all of whom were hungry for the truth that he had to offer, which is what the word Dhamma or Dharma means, truth. But not everything was rosy in the garden. There is a story about one particular disciple of the Buddha's, Devadatta, who betrayed him. Devadatta was a devoted follower to begin with, but he became frustrated when he failed to progress towards becoming an arhat. In Pali and in the Mahayana tradition specifically, an arhat or an arahant is someone who's achieved enlightenment, a Buddha essentially. So, frustrated Devadatta applied his practice towards developing supernatural powers instead, rather than the realization of enlightenment. It was said that he also became driven by fierce jealousy of the Buddha. Devadatta believed that he should be the world-honored one, as the Buddha was known, one of his titles, and the leader of the order of monks, which was known as the Sangha, which is the community of Buddhists. Sangha now refers to the wider community of Buddhists. Devadatta vowed to have the Buddha murdered so that he could take over the Sangha. Now, so that the murder could not be traced back to him, the plan was to send a second group of hitmen to assassinate the first group that would kill the Buddha. But then a third group would take out the second one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one, and so on for a ridiculous amount of time, all in an attempt to cover up his attacks. But when the first group of would-be assassins got near the Buddha, they could not carry out their orders. So, Devadatta decided to try and do the job himself. First, by dropping a huge rock on the Buddha's head, but as legend has it, and as the story goes, it bounces off the mountainside and breaks and shatters into pieces, causing the Buddha absolutely no harm. The next attempt involved a large bull elephant in a drug-induced fury, but the elephant also did no harm. As it approached the Buddha calmed it down, or it was calmed in his presence. Finally, Devadatta attempted to split up the Sangha by claiming superior moral rectitude, meaning that he was better than the Buddha. He proposed a list of austerities or rules, if you like, and asked that the Sangha, the community, asked them that these rules should become mandatory, compulsory for all monks and nuns. Devadatta persuaded 500 monks that his super austerity plan, which is something that Scotland might need after the pandemic, was a superior, surer path to enlightenment than the Buddha's, and they followed Devadatta to become his disciples. Now, in response to this, the Buddha sent just 2 of his own disciples, Sariputra and Mahamaya de Gulayana, to teach the Dharma and the Dhamma, or the truth, to these wayward monks. Upon hearing the Dharma explained correctly, the 500 monks returned to the side of the Buddha. Devadatta was now a sorry and broken man, and he soon became ill and died. On his deathbed, it is said that he repented of his sins and wished to see the Buddha one last time. It was a very, very hot day, so that on the way to the Buddha, his litter bearers, which is a word to describe people who attended to him, looked after his needs as he travelled, had to stop and cool down because it was so hot in the waters nearby. Devadatta tried to do the same, but the moment that he stepped onto the ground, the earth opened up and swallowed him whole. Before reaching the clear water, before reaching the Buddha and asking for his forgiveness, he left this physical mortal world doomed to be reborn again in samsara, according to his kama or karma. Now, kama or karma, which is a word that I'm sure you've all said, all heard, and all used, is a grossly misunderstood idea in Western civilizations especially. We will talk more about it later, but suffice to say that you should think of it as a law, like gravity, that governs how the universe works, according to Buddhist philosophy. The word itself, kama or karma, means action. You can have good or bad karma, and the balance is what determines the nature of your rebirth in the endless cycle known as samsara. But it is not a conscious force. It's not like karma's going to get you. And it isn't something that is always immediately apparent in the life that you're living. That law, like gravity, is a law that cannot be broken. It just is. Now, back to our story. At around the age of 80, it's said that that's when the Buddha entered what's known as Parinirvana or Paranibbana, depending on Pali or Sanskrit, which is basically physical death. This is when he left his body behind and died, but not in such a way that he would be reborn again into the endless cycle of rebirth, samsara. He abandoned, after achieving enlightenment, he was able to escape this wheel of life, abandoned that, and finally achieved what's known as this state of non-consciousness, nibbana, nirvana. It's the state of the end of the physical body, as well as, at the same time, what happens when we reach enlightenment, or nibbana, nirvana. Think of a line of candles. Each candle represents another rebirth. And the energy that keeps you tied to this endless cycle of rebirth, the only thing that's passed on from life to life after you're reborn, is represented in this case by the flame. It's not so much of a thing as an energy, as a force. That's kama. That's the karma part, the flame. The flame can be passed on from candle to candle. I can take the flame from that first candle and use it to light the second candle, and so on. Nothing about the series of candles is the same. The candles can be a different shape, color, size, fragrance, any other change that you wish. It is only the energy that's transferred to light or to bring alive that new candle. Now, if I take any one of those candles and blow it out so that there is nothing left to pass on to the next candle, that is nibbana. That's nirvana. Not a place so much, but an end to the cycle of rebirth. An end to the karmic energy that is being passed on life to life. The word nibbana or nirvana literally means blown out. And in fact, if the Buddha, when he had first preached his sermon at Deer Park, had spoken in English, he would have said that the goal of following his path, his middle way, the Eightfold Path, Magga, which is the fourth noble truth, is to escape the cycle of rebirth and be blown out. Blown out. So, after his physical death, the Buddha's body was then cremated, and his remains were placed inside what's called stupas. And you will find stupas all throughout the world today, particularly at monasteries and at sacred places in the Buddhist world. They're domed structures. There's a picture on your screen now. They're common in Buddhism. In Thailand, they're called chedis. They are found all over the world, like I said, but mostly in places like China, Myanmar, Sri Lanka. The ashes of the Buddha's body after cremation are said to have been preserved, and remnants of those ashes and of the Buddha's body, bits of bone, fingernail, different things like that, teeth, all of that have been, as stories go, as legend has it, preserved, kept safe, stored in stupas, and those are referred to as what we call relics, and relics have a very, very important role within Buddhist worship and meditation.
Hello, my name is Master Yung Hua. I reside here at the Lu Mountain Temple. It's a pleasure to introduce to you the 10,000 Buddha relics collection. Shriras in Sanskrit are the crystallized remains that formed when the Buddha's body was cremated. This rare oval-shaped shrira came from his heart. Prize of our collection is a tooth relic. This tooth is almost 3 inches long. It has been growing since the Buddha entered Nirvana about 3,000 years ago. It is said that seeing the Buddha's relics is the same as seeing the Buddha himself. It will bring peace and prosperity and safety to this country.
We will talk more about relics later when we come to the idea of Buddhist worship and meditation and what that's all about. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Don't forget to take notes in our next lesson, more on the Four Noble Truths and the greater reality.